Hello, I'm Jaime Hernandez from HHS Office for Human Resource Protection. I'm here to give you an overview of the changes to Exemptions 1, 2, 3, and 5 in the Revised Common Rule, which was published on January 19, 2017. The first thing that I would like to address about the exemptions is that the actual location of the exemptions within the regulatory text has changed. In the Pre-2018 Common Rule, the exemptions can be found under Section 101, which is titled, "To what does this policy apply?" In the Revised Common Rule, there is a new Section 104 titled Exempt Research, which includes all the exemptions within. Another clarification that's necessary to be made is that there has been no changes in the Revised Common Rule regarding who can make an exemption determination. It is still the case that institutions can implement their own policies. However, OHRP guidance provides that the institutional policies and procedures should identify clearly who is responsible for making such determinations. Also, it is still the case under the Revised Common Rule that it's not recommended for investigators to make their own exemption determinations. And lastly, OHRP will provide new decision charts, which hopefully will aid in making the determinations. Now let's talk about the exemptions themselves. This is a very general summary of the changes to the exemptions in the Revised Common Rule. Exemption 1 for educational practices has some new restrictions added. Exemption 2 for educational tests, surveys, interviews, and observation of public behavior has been expanded. Exception 3 for research on public officials has been entirely removed and replaced by a brand new exemption. Exemption 4 for research on existing data has been expanded with certain changes. And the same is true for Exemption 5, research on public benefits, has also been expanded with certain changes. Exemption 6 for taste of food evaluations remains exactly the same. And then there's the new Exemption 7 for the storage and maintenance, and new Exemption 8 for the secondary research use of identifiable biospecimens and identifiable information. Also, here in the exemptions, we see the new concept of limited IRB review, which is applicable to Exemptions 2, 3, 7, and 8. This presentation, however, will focus on Exemptions 1, 2, 3, and 5. For additional information regarding the changes to Exemption 4 and the additions of Exemptions 7 and 8, please refer to the webinar on secondary research. Now let's look at the exemptions. First, starting with Exemption 1. Exemption 1 has new restrictions added. Exemption 1 applies to research in established or commonly accepted educational settings. For example, the classroom, after-school programs, or online education. If the research involves normal educational practices, such as research on instructional techniques or classroom management, and there's a new restriction added. The research must not be likely to adversely impact the student's opportunity to learn required educational content or the assessment of educators who provide the instruction. Let's look at an example of this new restriction. Let's say that we're reviewing a research study, testing an instructional technique to teach algebra equations, but the new technique takes significant additional classroom hours away from other required topics. In this case, the research is in an established educational setting, in this case, the classroom. It involves normal educational practices. It's testing an instructional technique. However, we need to consider whether this research will adversely impact the student's opportunity to learn other required educational content. We are told that the research takes significant classroom time away from other topics. This may negatively affect students' scores in their exams. If such is the case, this doesn't mean that the research cannot be done. It only means that it will not qualify for this exemption, and it may require IRB review, assuming that no other exemptions apply. Regarding Exemption 2, there have been two changes to it. The first change is a language clarification. Exemption 2 now reads, that is applicable to research that only includes interactions involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, and observation of public behavior. The additional language only includes interaction. It's not so much of a change as a clarification of what is already OHRP position in the pre-2018 Common Rule. And that position is that Exemption 2 only applies to research involving interactions of the types that are listed therein. Exemption 2 generally is not applicable to research involving interventions. However, much of social, behavioral, and educational research that include interventions will now be exempt under the new Exemption 3, which will be discussed shortly. The second change to Exemption 2 is that it has been expanded. So now more research could qualify for the exemption than in the pre-2018 Common Rule. Exemption 2, which normally applies to research that involves interactions involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, and or observation of public behavior, if the information collected is recorded in a non-identifiable manner, that is, that it cannot be linked back to the subjects readily. Or if the information collected is not sensitive, or in other words, if there's any disclosure of the information, there will not be a lot of risks to subjects. Or, this is the new addition in the revised Common Rule, if the information collected is identifiable, even if it is sensitive, but there's a limited IRB review of the privacy and confidentiality protections, the research may also qualify for Exemption 2. Let's look at a couple of examples regarding Exemption 2, starting with an example about the language clarification. In a research study, subjects are asked to answer an anonymous questionnaire about cocaine use. This qualifies for Exemption 2 because the research consists only of a survey procedure, and the information recorded the information is being recorded anonymously, despite of how sensitive it may be. However, let's say that in the same study, in addition to this questionnaire, subjects are also asked to attend a brief substance abuse training. And then they have to answer the same anonymous questionnaire to determine whether the training affected the subject's perception of cocaine use. This does not qualify for Exemption 2 because now there is an intervention aiming to alter the subject's opinions or perceptions of their environment. In this case, the intervention is attending the training. This may, however, qualify for Exemption 3 for benign behavioral interventions, and this we will discuss shortly. Let's now look at an example about the expansion of Exemption 2. A study interviews rape victims and their ER physicians to rate their interactions with one another, and the data is collected in an identifiable manner. In the pre-2018 Common Rule, Exemption 2 will not apply, because the data is identifiable and also rather sensitive. However, in the 2018 Common Rule, the revised Exemption 2 may apply even if the information is both identifiable and sensitive, but only after an IRB makes a limited review and a determination of the appropriateness of the privacy and confidentiality protections. Next, let's look at what happened to Exemption 3 in the pre-2018 Common Rule. Exemption 3 has become superfluous after clarifications and changes that were made in the revised 2018 Common Rule. One of these clarifications is that Exemption 3 is often erroneously applied to activities that otherwise do not meet the regulatory definition of research. For example, if a journalist investigates how the policy of the town's mayor have contributed to the opioid crisis in the town, this activity focuses directly and exclusively on the one individual about whom the information is being collected, and this activity does not contribute to generalizable knowledge. The 2018 Common Rule explicitly clarifies that historical and journalistic activities that focus on one person do not meet the regulatory definition of research. In other words, public officials are accountable to journalistic inquiries without the protections that the Common Rule provides for research subjects. Another reason for removing the pre-2018 Exemption 3 is that this exemption applies to research involving the use of educational tests, surveys, or interview procedures, or observation of public behaviors that were not covered by Exemption 2, if the subjects were elected or appointed officials, or if there was a federal statute protecting confidentiality. However, most of the research that will not qualify for Exemption 2 is because it collected information that was both sensitive and identifiable. But now that the revised common rule has expanded Exemption 2 to cover information that is both, or the collection of information rather, that is both sensitive and identifiable, if there is a limited IRB review, there's virtually nothing left for Exemption 3 to cover. So let's look at an example of this removal. A series of interviews with elected officials seek to determine whether political scandals increased their personal net worth of the elected officials. This study meets the definition of research because it seeks to produce generalizable knowledge about all elected officials. Therefore, if the data is recorded in a non-identifiable manner, Exemption 2 will apply. Similarly, if the data collected is not sensitive, Exemption 2 will apply. And now, with the expansion of Exemption 2 under the revised common rule, if the data is both recorded in an identifiable manner and sensitive, Exemption 2 may apply after a limited IRB review. If Exemption 2 does not apply, again, it doesn't mean that the research cannot be conducted. It means that it will not qualify for the exemption, and it may require IRB review, assuming that no other exemptions apply. In other words, public officials that participate in research as human subjects have the same protections as any other human subject in research. And now let's look at the new Exemption 3, which has replaced the pre-2018 Exemption 3. The new Exemption 3 applies to research involving benign behavioral interventions with adults who prospectively agree when the information collected is limited to verbal or written responses, including data entry or audiovisual recordings. And if the information recorded cannot be readily linked back to the subjects, or it is not sensitive, or it is identifiable and sensitive. However, there's a limited IRB review for protections of privacy and confidentiality. Why are we exempting behavioral interventions? The main reason is that IRB review of this low-risk research adds very little additional protections to human subjects. However, we understand that autonomy should continue to be protected. Therefore, we kept a requirement for prospective agreement, which will be discussed shortly. New Exemption 3 also expands the number of social, behavioral, and educational research that can now be exempted under the revised common rule. Since Exemption 2 is for interactions involving only the specific information collection procedures listed, interventional research that is not exempt under 2 can now be exempt under Exemption 3, of course if it meets the requirements of the exemption. This facilitates the conduct of low-risk research and reduces the workload for IRBs. The applicability test for Exemption 3 contains the same requirements as Exemption 2. That is, that the information recorded cannot be readily linked back to the subjects, or any information disclosure will not place the subjects at risk of harm, or information is both identifiable and sensitive, but there is a limited IRB review for privacy and confidentiality protections. However, there are additional requirements for Exemption 3 to apply. For example, it applies to behavioral interventions only. It is not applicable to biomedical research. It is only for research in adults. It's not applicable to research with children. The behavioral intervention must be benign in nature. Benign means that it's brief in duration. The intervention itself must be brief in duration, even if subsequent data collection takes longer. Also, the intervention must be harmless, painless, and not physically invasive. In other words, it's not expected that the intervention will cause physical or emotional harm. Also, the intervention must not be likely to have a significant adverse lasting impact on subjects. In other words, not expected to cause persistent or long-term discomfort. And also, the investigator must have no reason to believe that the intervention will be offensive or embarrassing to subjects, considering the subject population, the context of the research, the topic, and other characteristics of the study. Let's look at an example of a behavioral intervention. Adult subjects are interviewed after watching a 30-minute video about clinical trials to determine if this influences their feelings or opinions about clinical research. The intervention in this case, which is watching the video, is brief, roughly 30 minutes. Note that if the subjects are further interviewed in the future, let's say weekly for the next 3 months, the intervention itself, which is watching the video, remains a brief intervention. In this case, also watching the video is harmless, painless, and not physically invasive. Watching the video is not likely to have a significant adverse impact on the subjects. And lastly, there's no reason to think that subjects will be offended or embarrassed for watching a video about clinical trials. Therefore, this may qualify for Exemption 3. However, there's additional requirements. The adult subjects must prospectively agree to the benign behavioral intervention. Prospective agreement must be meaningful and not coerced. However, this is not the same as the regulatory requirements for informed consent or the documentation of consent. And prospective agreement includes authorized deception research. This is when the subjects are informed that they will be deceived about some aspects of the research, and they prospectively agree to the deception. Let's look at an example of prospective agreement. If adult subjects are interviewed after watching a 30-minute video about clinical trials to determine if this influences their feelings about clinical research. In this case, investigators must have asked the subjects to watch the video, and subjects must have agreed to watch the video. Also, investigators at some point must have asked the subjects to be interviewed, and the subjects must have agreed. This is a prospective agreement. It doesn't have to meet all the elements of informed consent and the documentation of informed consent. A simple but meaningful and voluntary prospective agreement to participate in the intervention is sufficient. Let's look at an example of what is authorized deception. If adult subjects are interviewed after watching a political campaign video to determine if gender affects their political opinions, they are told that they will be informed about the purpose of the interview only after they finish, and the subjects agree to participate. This is authorized deception because the subjects are aware that they don't have all the information about the study and have nonetheless agreed to participate. This may qualify for Exemption 3 if it meets all the other requirements. What is not authorized deception is if, for example, subjects are not informed at all that they are being video recorded to analyze their facial expressions. In this case, the subjects have not agreed, they are not aware of the deception and have not agreed about it. Therefore, it's not authorized deception and it does not qualify for Exemption 3. Once again, it doesn't mean that the research cannot be done. It only means that it will not qualify for this exemption without modifications to the protocol, and it may require IRB review. Now, after discussing the changes to Exemptions 2 and 3, or the addition of the new Exemption 3, we should talk about the new concept of limited IRB review that appears for the first time here. The revised Exemptions 2 and 3 allow for some studies that used to require IRB review to now be exempt after a limited review under the revised common rule. In particular, this is true for studies that collect identifiable information, even if sensitive. The review in these cases is limited to a determination that there are adequate provisions to protect the privacy of the subjects and maintain the confidentiality of the data. That's it. there's no need to conduct a complete Section 111 review. Also, the limited IRB review can be done using the expedited review mechanism, and there's no need or there's no requirement for a continuing limited IRB review. Let's look at an example of limited IRB review. A study that interviews rape victims and their ER physicians to rate their interactions with one another. The data is collected in an identifiable manner. Under the Pre-2018 Common Rule, Exemption 2 will not apply because the data collected is both identifiable and rather sensitive. However, under the 2018 Common Rule, Exemption 2 may apply after a limited IRB review. The review is limited to the appropriateness of the privacy and confidentiality protections. The study is not required to undergo an entire Section 111 IRB review, considering, for example, whether the selection of subjects is equitable, the informed consent requirements, the documentation of consent. None of that is necessary under the limited IRB review. If the study or if the IRB is satisfied with the privacy and confidentiality protections, it can determine that the exemption is met. And this can be done employing the expedited mechanism, and it doesn't need a continuing review. The last exemption that we're going to discuss today is Exemption 5. Exemption 5 has been expanded to cover more research than it does under the Pre-2018 Common Rule. Exemption 5 applies to research that is designed to study, evaluate, improve, or otherwise examine public benefit or public service programs. In the Pre-2018 Common Rule, the research had to be conducted by a federal agency to qualify for exemption. This has been expanded to include research that is also funded by a federal agency, for example, through a grant mechanism. Also, there's a new requirement that the federal agency conducting or sponsoring the research has to publish a list of the projects that are covered by this exemption. Let's look at an example of this expansion. If the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, funds through a grant mechanism for a local university to evaluate a certain CMS program that reimburses beneficiaries for nursing care at home, under the Pre-2018 Common Rule, Exemption 5 will not apply because the research was not conducted by the federal agency. But under the revised Common Rule, Exemption 5 applies because the research is funded by the federal agency. And at last, let's address some of the changes in the revised Common Rule that affect the applicability of Subparts C and D. First, let's look at Subpart C, or research involving prisoners. Under the Pre-2018 Common Rule, none of the exemptions apply to Subpart C. Under the revised Common Rule, it is still the case that none of the exemptions apply to research aimed at involving prisoners or with high expectations that subjects will become prisoners during the conduct of the research. However, the exemptions may apply to research aimed at involving a broader subject population and only incidentally includes prisoners. So, for example, if some of the subjects become prisoners during the conduct of the study doesn't lose its exempt status and it doesn't need Subpart C review. Next, let's look at Subpart D, or research involving children. Under the Pre-2018 Common Rule, Exemption 2 does not apply to research involving survey or interview of children, or the observation of children in activities that the investigators are participating. These restrictions remain in place in the revised Common Rule. And in addition to them, the new provision for research that collects sensitive and identifiable information with limited IRB review is also not applicable to research with children. The brand new Exemption 3 for benign behavioral interventions is also not applicable to research with children in its entirety. Under the pre-2018 Common Rule, all the other exemptions apply to research with children, and they continue to apply to research with children under the revised Common Rule. And with this, we end our discussions of the changes to Exemptions 1, 2, 3, and 5 under the revised Common Rule. Please refer to the text of the revised Common Rule available on OHRP's website for a complete and accurate description of these changes. For this presentation, please review the regulatory requirements at Section 46.101b of the pre-2018 Common Rule and Section 46.104 of the revised Common Rule. If you have questions about the revised Common Rule, you may email us at OHRP@HHS.gov. Also, check out our website for other videos on the revised Common Rule and additional resources. Our website is www.hhs.gov/OHRP. Thank you very much for your attention.